Let's check out a real world problem. Here it says the fixed cost for manufacturing a type of stereo system is $96,000 with a variable cost of $80 per unit. As a reminder, fixed means does not change. So this 96,000 does not change. Variable means it'll change depending on a certain variable. You know, there's a X value, a C value, a unit value. This one will be in units. So it says the total cost for making X stereos is given by this relationship. So we always have a $96,000 cost. That maybe we divide materials, stuff like that. But then $80 per stereo we make. So now it says explain why the inverse function exists. Then find the inverse. Well, the explanation, the first thing it asks us to do, the explanation is simple. This graph passes the horizontal line test. So this is the function here, is I would just say for explanation, f of x passes the horizontal line test. I just abbreviated there. The horizontal line test. It passes, and this is one-to-one because it also passes the vertical line test. So that's explained. Now it says find the inverse of x. So to do that, what we first do is we take our equation, change that to a y, and we're going to substitute x and y. So we'd say x equals 96,000 plus 80y. And now we solve for y. So the first step I would need to do here, if I was going to get y isolated to solve for it, is I would subtract 96,000. Now I need to divide by 80. And when you divide the whole thing. If we can simplify, we can. So we can check real quick in the calculator. Can we simplify 96,000 divided by 80? We can to 1,200. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rewrite this equation as x over 80, minus, is it 120 or 1,200? I think it's 1,200. Let me go back. Yeah, 1,200. And all that would equal y. So you could rewrite the inverse as x over 80 minus 1,200. There's your inverse. Now, that's just part A. We've got 3 more parts with this. So let's look at part B. All right, part B. So we have the same problem, but when we get here, it says, what do the inverse and x represent in the inverse function? So let's look back at the equation. So originally, x represented stereos. If you remember, x was stereos, and cost was f of x in the original. Oops, I'm sorry, went the wrong way. So I want to write that down. In the original, f of x equaled cost, and x was the stereos. So what would its inverse represent? Well, the inverse function, because you switched your x's and y's, the inverse function represents stereos, and x now represents cost. So you switch your x's and y's. So that's what they represent in the inverse. All right? So go to part C. Same problem. Until right here, it says, what restrictions, if any, should be placed on the domain of f of x and the inverse? Explain. Now, let's go back to the picture real quick. Okay, we're looking at the picture. We ask, what restrictions, if any, should be placed on the domain? Well, here's what I know. We can never have negative stereos. So on the original, we had, for f, we had a domain that was from 0 to infinity. We can make, the fewest is 0 stereos. And because of that, the range, the lowest cost we could ever have was 96,000. Remember, that was the fixed cost. You always have that cost no matter what, and the cost only went up. Well, so for the inverse, we do have restrictions. For the inverse, we'll say the new domain was this one's range. So the fewest we could ever have is 96,000 in cost, and that would go to infinity. And the range would be from 0 to infinity. They just flip-flop. This, though, it says what restrictions, if any, should be placed on this. And so this is the restriction that needs to be placed. And the reason being is the smallest cost we could ever have is $96,000. That's a fixed cost. You're always going to have it. So that would be your explanation. Finally, last part. It says find the total number of stereos made if the cost was $216,000. So here's where having that inverse function comes in handy. Let me pay. Okay, and so now here's the inverse, which means on the inverse, x is cost. So if the cost was 216,000, that's what I plug in. I would say 216,000 divided by 80 minus 1,200 will give me my number. So I'm going to go over to the calculator and just type this in. We would have 216,000. Oops. 216,000 divided by 80 minus 1,200, and we get 1,500. So that's how many stereos were had to be made to have that cost. And there's the work for that. Now you try this one.